All right, so are you ready for a deep dive into a case that's both heartbreaking and disturbing?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Okay, cool. Today we're looking at the murder of Christine Huntsman.
Oh, this one's
She went by CJ to her friends,
yeah.
and she was a truly kind soul, always willing to help, but unfortunately that kindness was exploited in the absolute worst way.
Yeah. That's one of the things that always gets me about these cases is how people can be so cruel to those who are just trying to be good.
It's a real tragedy,
Yeah.
and this story really highlights those dark sides of human nature.
The mob mentality.
Yeah, exactly. The mob mentality and how someone's vulnerability can make them a target.
Yeah, and what I find particularly fascinating about this case is the way it all unfolded. It went from being a cold case for years to suddenly being revived by this unexpected confession.
And then you have these really complex relationships between CJ and her abusers. It really makes you think about human behavior and just how far people can go. So to start off, let's paint a picture of CJ for our listeners. She was 45 years old, she lived on her own, and she had a history of seizures.
Right.
But what really stood out about her was her incredibly kind nature.
Yeah, always ready to lend a hand. She also received some financial assistance from her father, who lived in Nevada.
And that detail about her dad ends up being super important later on.
Extremely important. They talked every week, so there was a clear pattern of communication.
Yeah, those regular calls with her dad really help establish that timeline.
A timeline of her disappearance.
Right. And it was because of that timeline that her dad became alarmed. After 6 weeks of no contact, he knew something was terribly wrong.
He started calling her, and these strange people were answering her phone. Didn't know who these people were.
So, understandably, he reported her missing. So what did the police uncover in those initial stages of the investigation?
Well, they found out that CJ was last seen with this guy named Michael Perez and his two girlfriends, Virginia Backland and Desiree James.
And were these women cooperative with the police?
Not at all. They were dismissive of CJ. It was like they were trying to make her seem insignificant.
That she wasn't even worth looking for.
Right, exactly.
Uh,
And they even tried to shift the blame to her ex-boyfriend, a guy named Troy.
they tried to make him look like the suspect.
Yeah, a classic red herring.
But I'm guessing the police weren't buying it.
No, especially not when they discovered that CJ's credit card had been used at a gas station very close to Perez's apartment after she disappeared.
Okay, so they're starting to see a connection here.
Yeah, a pretty strong one. And the purchases made with the card were really unsettling. A wheelchair,
A wheelchair.
bleach, alcohol, rubber gloves.
It sounds like they were trying to cover something up.
It really does. You don't just buy those things on a whim.
No. So what happened next?
Well, then they found CJ's car abandoned.
Was there anything significant about the car?
The window had been smashed.
Was there any forced entry?
Turns out some random couple had broken into it and tried to sell it off. Just this weird coincidence that kind of muddied the waters of the investigation.
Wow, talk about bad luck for the investigation.
Yeah, it's like one step forward, two steps back. And then, to make matters worse, the detective who was assigned to the case, he died in a car accident.
Oh, no.
So the case was put on hold.
So essentially, the case went cold for 4 years.
4 long years.
I can't imagine the frustration CJ's family must have felt during that time. No answers, no justice.
It's tough because time can be a real enemy in cases like this. But on the other hand, sometimes time can also create opportunities. Relationships change, people's motives change, and sometimes guilt can eat away at someone for years until they finally crack.
And that's what ended up happening in CJ's case, right? After all those years, Virginia Backland, one of the women CJ was last seen with, she reached out to the police.
She did. She contacted the police and confessed to witnessing CJ's murder.
Wow, that must have been a huge break for the investigators. But why, after all this time? What was her motivation for confessing?
It's a bit complicated. She was facing the possibility of losing custody of her child to Child Protective Services. So it seems she thought that by admitting to this crime, it might somehow work in her favor, like a desperate plea for leniency.
That's a risky gamble. So what did she tell the police? What did she reveal about CJ's murder?
What she revealed was truly horrifying. She claimed that CJ was tortured for 3 days in Perez's bathtub, scalding water, beatings, even waterboarding, and she said it was all done by Perez, Desiree James, and herself.
3 days. That's just unimaginable. And she also mentioned 2 other women involved, Tabitha and Natasha.
Yes. So it wasn't just the three of them. 5 people were potentially involved in this.
It's just sickening. What possible justification could they have had for such brutality?
Well, Backland claimed that they initially attacked CJ because they believed she had run a stop sign with one of their kids in the car.
A stop sign. They tortured her for days because of a stop sign. It's just mind-boggling.
And to make matters worse, Tabitha later confirmed this story, saying she had witnessed CJ in the bathtub, badly injured. She had heard them talking about the stop sign incident.
So their twisted motive for this horrific act was rooted in some kind of vigilante justice. It's just insane. And what about Tabitha? She witnessed this abuse, but didn't call for help. What does that say about her role in all of this?
It's a very unsettling aspect of the case. Tabitha's silence is disturbing. It really makes you question, was it fear? Was it some kind of twisted loyalty? Or was it just plain apathy? It's hard to say. It raises that really difficult ethical question. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have had the courage to speak up?
It's a question that really gets to the heart of human nature, doesn't it? It's easy to judge from the outside, but when you're actually in that situation, facing those kinds of threats and pressures, it's a whole different story. So the police now had this incredibly disturbing confession from Backland. But how did they corroborate her story? And what about Perez and James? Did they ever admit to their involvement?
That's where the investigation takes a really fascinating turn, and that's what we'll get into after the break. So right before the break, we were talking about how the police got this confession from Virginia Backland.
Yeah, a pretty shocking confession.
Yeah. And now they had to figure out how to use it. So they had this challenge of trying 3 separate defendants for CJ's murder.
3 separate trials.
Yeah. They decided to try Perez and James together, since they were a couple, and they had that joint confession. But Backland's case, that was handled on its own.
Okay, that makes sense. So with Backland, they had her confession, but what was her defense?
Well, her defense was basically that she was a victim.
A victim.
Of domestic violence at the hands of Michael Perez.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Her lawyers argued that she was basically forced into taking part in this whole thing because she was so terrified of him.
So they were trying to paint her as a victim, even though she actively participated in these horrible acts.
Exactly. And it's a really complicated issue, because domestic violence is a very serious crime, and it can totally affect how someone behaves.
Yeah, for sure.
It can even push them to do things they'd never normally do.
Right.
But the question is, at what point does that fear, that coercion, actually excuse what they did?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I imagine the jury really struggled with that. Did they believe her?
Well, it's hard to say for sure what goes on in a jury room.
Of course.
But to back up her claims, Backland's lawyers actually brought in an expert.
An expert on domestic violence.
Exactly. Someone who specialized in the psychological effects of being abused for a long time.
And what did this expert say?
Well, they talked about how this constant abuse could mess with your ability to make good decisions.
I can see that.
And how it could even lead victims to take part in things they wouldn't normally agree with, just out of fear.
Yeah, that makes sense. So did this expert testimony actually sway the jury? Did it work?
Well, even with the expert and everything her lawyers argued, the jury still found her guilty.
Guilty.
Of first-degree murder and torture, just like Perez and James.
Wow, so even with that defense, they still held her accountable for what happened to CJ.
They did. And it shows just how serious her actions were in the eyes of the law. And also it shows how strong the prosecution's case was. Remember, they had those detailed confessions from that interrogation where they put Perez and James in the same room.
Right.
And then they had Tabitha backing up those details with her own testimony. It all came together to paint a really clear picture for the jury.
Yeah, a really grim picture. So, speaking of Tabitha, she testified in all 3 trials, right?
She did, and in each trial, her testimony was really powerful. She gave even more disturbing details about everything leading up to CJ's death.
What kind of details?
Well, for example, she said that she had warned Perez about CJ's driving.
Her driving?
Yeah. She was worried that CJ was being reckless behind the wheel, and she even suggested it might be because of jealousy.
Jealousy?
Jealousy over any woman that Perez was with.
So even their twisted reasoning for attacking her was based on possessiveness and jealousy. It just shows how toxic and dangerous that whole group dynamic was.
Absolutely. It's a classic example of how those kinds of negative emotions can escalate into violence.
Yeah. Did Tabitha mention anything else?
Oh, yeah. She also shared that she had begged the trio, Perez, James, and Backland, to get CJ some medical help. But they just ignored her. She described how they went about their lives like nothing was happening.
Well, CJ was suffering in that bathtub.
Exactly.
That's just heartbreaking. It's like
Yeah.
they had zero regard for human life. Were there any other really impactful moments during the trials that you remember?
One moment that really stuck with me was when the prosecution directly asked Tabitha why she didn't call 911.
Oh, wow. I can't even imagine being in that position. To see someone suffering like that and not call for help. What did she say?
Well, she said she regretted it deeply. She tried to explain it away by saying she thought someone else must have called because she could hear sirens in the background. But ultimately, she admitted that she didn't do anything herself to make sure CJ got help.
It must be incredibly heavy,
Yeah.
carrying that weight. To know that a simple phone call could have potentially changed everything.
It's a huge burden, and it raises a lot of questions about our responsibility to each other. The prosecutor even explained that legally, you don't actually have to report a crime.
Really? Even if you see it happening.
Yeah, it might be morally wrong, but it's not legally required.
That's hard to believe. It seems like basic human decency would make you want to help.
You'd think so, but sometimes the law doesn't line up with common sense.
Yeah. So they got the guilty verdicts, but what about the sentencing? What happened there?
The sentencing hearings were really intense, a lot of emotion in the room. CJ's friends and family, they gave these incredibly moving impact statements. They talked about her kindness, how much she made them laugh, and the huge hole that her death left in their lives.
I can only imagine how hard that must have been for them to face the people who took CJ from them and share all of that pain.
It was a really powerful moment. It showed just how deeply violence can affect people, not just the victim, but everyone around them. And during the sentencing, the judge, he made a really strong statement too.
What did he say?
He said that this crime was one of the most horrific he'd ever seen in his 25 years as a judge.
Wow. For a judge to say something like that, he's seen it all. Yeah.
He has, and that's what makes his statement so powerful. It really underscores the brutality and senselessness of this whole thing, and it emphasizes how important it is for us to protect the vulnerable people in our communities.
So what sentences did they get? Perez, James, and Backland.
They all got life in prison without parole. That's the toughest sentence you can get in California for this type of crime.
Wow. So they'll be behind bars for the rest of their lives.
That's right. They'll have plenty of time to think about what they did. And while it can't bring CJ back, it does offer some sense of justice for her and those who loved her.
Yeah, it's some measure of justice. Were there any other notable things that happened during the sentencing?
There was one thing that really stood out. Several of the jurors who decided the case, they actually came back to watch the sentencing.
Really? Why would they do that? I mean, their job was done.
A lot of them said they felt this deep empathy for CJ and her family.
It's understandable.
They wanted to see the case through to the very end, to be there for that final chapter. Some of them even went to the oak tree where it all started.
That's incredible.
They left flowers, said some prayers, paid their respects to CJ.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how much this case affected everyone involved, even those who were just there to judge the facts. It speaks to the lasting impact of empathy, the human need to find meaning in the face of tragedy. So we've covered the trial, the sentencing, but what happened after that? Did the police ever follow up on Natasha, the other woman who Backland mentioned?
That's a really good question. And that leads us into the final part of our deep dive.
So before the break, we were talking about Natasha and whether the police ever followed up on her.
Yeah, it's a real mystery. Backland mentioned her, said she was there at the oak tree for the initial attack.
Right.
But from what we can tell, the police never found her or even questioned her.
It's like a loose end, you know? It makes you wonder if there's more to the story that we just don't know.
I agree. And it shows you how hard it is to investigate these kinds of crimes. You have all these people involved, their stories changing, motives you can't quite figure out. Sometimes you just can't answer every question.
So we may never know the full story about Natasha, but what about the others? Perez, James, and Backland. Where are they now?
They're all serving life sentences, no chance of parole.
Wow.
Yeah, they're in separate prisons here in California.
So they'll be behind bars for the rest of their lives.
Most likely, yes. They'll have a lot of time to think about what they did. And while it doesn't bring CJ back, it does give some sense of justice for her and her loved ones.
I imagine it does. Speaking of CJ's family and friends, how have they been coping with this? It must be so hard to heal from something like this.
You're right. The pain from a crime like this runs deep. The trial and sentencing might have brought some closure, but it doesn't erase the pain of losing her so brutally.
No, of course not. I remember their statements during the sentencing. They were so powerful. They talked about CJ's generosity, her laugh, the hole she left in their lives. It was really a reminder that violence doesn't just affect the victim, it affects everyone they know.
It does. Those statements were really moving. They showed how much CJ was loved and how much her life mattered. It reminds us that these acts of violence send shockwaves through families and communities. Even those who are just trying to seek justice are impacted.
This case really makes you think about the importance of speaking up when you see something wrong. Like Tabitha, she didn't say anything, and that might have made things worse for CJ. What can we learn from that?
Tabitha's story is a tough one, but it's a lesson for all of us. If you see something bad happening, if you witness abuse or anything like that, don't stay silent. Speak up, even if it's scary. You might be the only one who can make a difference. And even if it's years later, coming forward can still help get justice, like it did for CJ.
It's terrifying to think that evil can be so close to us, that someone you think you know could be capable of such cruelty. CJ trusted these people, and they took advantage of that in the worst way.
It's a reminder that we have to be careful. We need to recognize those red flags of manipulation and abuse. We need to build a culture where speaking up against injustice is encouraged.
So much to think about. This deep dive has been really informative, but it's also left me feeling pretty heavy. Is there anything we can do as individuals to prevent tragedies like this? How can we protect ourselves and others from the darkness that can be hidden in people?
That's the big question, isn't it? There's no easy answer, but we can start by promoting kindness and empathy. We have to value those things above all else.
It's about building a better world.
It is. We have to challenge toxic behaviors in ourselves and others, create safe spaces where people can speak freely and hold each other accountable.
That's a good point.
And we need to support organizations that are working to stop violence and help victims. We all have to work together on this. It can't just be a few people.
It sounds like you're saying we need to change our whole perspective, to be more actively involved in creating a more compassionate world.
That's exactly it. This case, as awful as it is, can teach us to be better. If we learn from CJ's story, if we hold each other accountable, if we choose empathy over indifference, maybe we can create a future where these tragedies don't happen anymore.
I like that. That's a message I hope our listeners take to heart. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been heartbreaking, but it's also given us a lot to think about.
It has.
We encourage you to keep talking about these issues, to reflect on what we've discussed, and to be part of the solution in your own communities. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.